Bible records a situation in which God wanted to kill Moses as he was following Midian to Egypt. According to most translations of Exodus's biblical text, chapter 4, Moses was in an inn when God's wrath lit against him, and was only placated after Moses' firstborn son, Gerson, was eventually circumcised. But many people, when reading this biblical text, are not understanding what really happened at that time. After all, why did God want to kill Moses right after he called him to go to Egypt to free the children of Israel? Or, why had the son of Moses to be circumcised? Or why did Moses' wife Zipporah have to resolve that situation and still said that Moses was a bloodthirsty husband? In this video, we will talk exactly about all this now. The first thing we need to admit here is that this biblical passage, in which supposedly God wanted to kill Moses, has a great difficulty of interpretation. Of exegetical point of view, most of the Old Testament scholars agree that this text of Exodus 4 is one of the most difficult to understand in the Bible. And why? Because, in fact, the Hebrew text is not clear about the details about what really happened at that time. For you to have an idea, the difficulty of this text is so great that it is not possible to determine even if God's wrath was lit against Moses himself or his son, Gerson, who had not yet been circumcised. The Hebrew text in this part is ambiguous and simply says that the Lord has found him and wanted to kill him. But this may be related to both Moses and Gerson. There is also no explanation of how God wanted to kill Moses or Gerson. Some commentators suggest that perhaps Moses has seriously sick. Others believe that God manifested himself there, who knows, in a kind of theophany, to hurt Moses. And others, in turn, argue that God's wrath he presented to Moses through the action of an agent. That is, through an angel sent as representative or messenger of the Lord. And this position is even supported by the translation of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. So far we have seen it is difficult to know if God wanted to kill Moses or if he wanted to kill Moses' son, Gerson, because the Hebrew text allows the two possibilities of interpretation, and we do not know how exactly God wanted to kill either. But then, the biblical text also reports that this episode came to an end after Zipporah, Moses' wife, have circumcised Gerson. But what is noteworthy is that in that context, Zipporah immediately told Moses that he was a bloodthirsty husband, and the text adds that she said that because of circumcision. And the understanding of this statement of Zipporah is also very difficult. We know that something similar was said in a rite of premarital circumcision, which was observed in some ancient peoples. And in this rite, the father-in-law circumcised the young man who was getting married, qualifying him as a husband. And this phrase was directed to the young man's father-in-law in the circumcator position. Was this the case in this biblical text? Did Zipporah spoke this phrase precisely in reference to this rite? We do not know. Other commentators, on the other hand, see in this phrase of Zipporah only the expression of her discontent with the rite of circumcision itself. Perhaps until that moment, Zipporah had not yet understood the meaning and importance of the sign of circumcision to the Israelites. Even those who understand this way suggest that Gerson had not yet been circumcised by a supposed opposition of Zipporah, who was a Midianite woman. In any case, there are many theories that try to explain this statement. But there is no certainty about any of them. That is, here we can summarize that this statement of Zipporah is really obscure. And before we continue our study, I want to tell you that you can study theology with us and improve your biblical knowledge to understand difficult biblical passages like this, all easily and through video lessons. In the set forth of this video has a link for you to know more information. Another common question of Bible readers in this text is because Gerson necessarily had to be circumcised. Obviously, the purpose of Gerson's circumcision was the same purpose as the circumcision of any Israelite boy. That is, to be a distinctive sign in the flesh that that boy belonged to God's people. However, it is also discussed among scholars the possibility that there was an additional purpose in this circumcision of Gerson. This is because the biblical text also says that Zipporah launched the flesh of circumcision at someone's feet, in verse 25 of chapter 4. And most translations of the Bible in Portuguese favors the idea that the feet were the feet of Moses. However, the original text says only your feet, not revealing the identity of the person. Then they could be Gerson's feet, for example, could be Moses' feet, or even the feet of an angel who acted like the messenger of the Lord in that episode. This, if we understand that there was an agent of God there. In addition, the term translated as pes was also used as an euphemism to the private parts of a person. And what does that mean? It means that we do not know if Zipporah has cast the meat of circumcision literally over a person's feet or the private parts of a person. If this last possibility is correct, then some biblical interpreters try to explain this attitude of Zipporah, suggesting that Gerson's circumcision was performed to replace the circumcision of Moses himself. Like this? Well, basically, the idea is that Moses, having been created as Egyptian, had not been circumcised under the molds of God's covenant with Israel. So, the fact that the skin from circumcision was thrown over Moses' feet, especially if the feet here are a reference to Moses' intimate organs, this was indicative that Gerson's circumcision was a type of vicarious circumcision for Moses himself, which, until then, he did not yet have the physical signal appropriate to the covenant of God with Abraham. However, this seems to be somewhat unlikely, because Moses reached Pharaoh's daughter at an age when the Hebrew boys had to be circumcised. Also, we know that when Moses was found in Rio, it was soon very clear that he was a Hebrew, perhaps because of circumcision. We do not know, but it could also be that Moses, even physically circumcised, really did not have a correct understanding of the need for circumcision within Israel's family, and that would even explain the fact that he has neglected his son's circumcision to that moment. Okay, so far it was clear that this text really is quite complicated to understand, and that we are not sure about his details. But what is its main meaning? After all, he was recorded in the Bible, and, of course, he has its importance within the narrative of the book of Exodus. Well, the truth is that despite all the difficulties of this biblical passage, the Lord's purpose is very clear at that time. Here it is worth remembering that within the covenant of God with Abraham, circumcision was precisely the identifier sign of those who belonged to the family of the covenant. Circumcision was the physical mark of those who were told as part of God's exclusive people. So while the text is not clear about exactly who and how God wanted to kill, the text is clear in showing why God wanted to kill. More than that, the text is also clear to show how divine wrath was placated at that time. It is interesting to note that the whole context involving that episode points to the Lord as the God who he chose Moses to lead the liberation of his chosen people out of Egypt, according to the promise made to Abraham and the covenant established with their offspring. In other words, one of the main themes of this passage is to present the Lord as the God of the covenant. This means that what happened to Moses on the way to Egypt was an occasion of repair. Moses was about to enter a land that would have all his firstborn killed by God's judgment. Moses' task in that land would be to free the people who were seen by God as their firstborn son, because the people of Israel figuratively is described in the same chapter 4 of Exodus in verse 22 as the firstborn of God. However, Moses was going to that mission without his own understanding, and had applied to his firstborn the sign that identified him as part of God's family, and separated him from the children from the pagan peoples. Can you realize the inconsistency in this? Obviously, this situation had to be corrected. In this way, the episode in which God wanted to kill Moses, or perhaps Gerson, had a pedagogical purpose. God showed his wrath to Moses to make him aware of his sin. However, he also showed his grace when his wrath was placated through the blood of circumcision, and then the life that was in danger was eventually spared. And so, with all this, certainly Moses was perfected to act as representative of God in Egypt.